My name is Raphael Muya, and I'm a program officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And I would like to mention two things before we start. Every year, the IEA Kenya has been holding annual pre-budget hearings. We normally hold one day for the corporate sector, and the next day we normally hold for the social sector. And the reason why we do this is to ensure that we are able to demarcate and allocate enough time where we are able to get enough proposals from the non-making profit institutions, but also at the same time with profit-making institutions. And largely the reason why we do this is to get these proposals so that as an institution, then we are able to synthesize these proposals as per the guidelines that are provided by the National Treasury. And what we look for is whether these proposals are making economic sense, but at the same time to look at whether to look at their feasibility and whether they are in line with the national priorities. So as I mentioned yesterday, we held our corporate sector pre-budget hearings. Essentially, we had a number of presentations from the agriculture sector, the manufacturing sector, but also we received the proposals from the water and sanitation, and largely other proposals that we are expecting to get from the tourism sector and also from the energy sector. So largely, that was that as for yesterday. So today, what we will be focusing on is on the social sector, and we have quite a number of presenters, and if I look at my chart, is that all of them, I can see all our presenters are around, and we have 4 presenters. We have Ms. Irene Boke from Transparency International. Irene Boke is the Deputy Program Manager, and she'll be sharing with us accountability in public debt management for progressive fiscal recovery post COVID-19 pandemic. The second presenter is from National Taxpayers Association. We have Mr. Joyfrey Koech, and Mr. Joyfrey Koech will be sharing with us the analysis or how do we actualize affirmative action funds for minority and the minority group. The third presenter will be a research manager, Mr. Amos Kaburu, and he will be sharing with us the funding transition in the education sector. And finally, we will have Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa. Emmanuel Manyasa is the Executive Director of Usawa Agenda, and he will be sharing with us budget priorities for seamless transition into the CBC. Having said that, we do have another presenter from Crown Trust, and we have Lilian, who will be aside sharing with us some of the proposals on women economic empowerment. So having said that, is that those are not the only proposals that we are expecting from the social sector. We do have other sectors that we are focusing on, and we have already spoken with a number of institutions. For example, Health Right Advocacy Forum, who will be sharing with us proposals on reproductive health and mental health proposals, so that we are able to synthesize the same and share with the National Treasury. Again, we will be receiving some proposals from the Juakari sector or the informal sector, focusing on the SMEs. And again, we also be receiving some proposals from the Kenya Alliance for Advancement of Children Light. So quite a range of proposals that we are expecting from various actors. But having said that, then it is important that because I've run through the program, then we start off. And before I start off, I would like to request for a kind request, is that as the meeting progress, I would request all of us, and I know our colleagues in the communication department have already muted some of us. I would request that we mute our microphone and the video when the presenters are making their presentation, so that it can be very clear from our end. So without further ado, I will invite our first presenter, Ms. Irene Boke. Irene Bokeh, you have 10 to 15 minutes so that you can be able to share with us the issues on accountability in public debt management. You can be able to, you can share your presentation and you can proceed. The time is yours.
Thank you, Raphael. Yes, good morning. My name is Bokeh. I work at Transparency International Kenya. I'll share with you some of the things that we think are sort of a recurrent problem that we've seen in each budget cycle. Yeah, to share that and just put it on presentation mode. Okay, so I'll switch off my camera to maintain the bandwidth. Yeah, so the layout of the presentation basically just to look at the status of the public debt, and just to mention, I think IEA are really the gurus on issues public finance management, particularly public debt. But these are what the presentations are what we think, are issues that can be considered in the next budget cycle or in the budget cycle that we're currently preparing for, so that we just ensure that there is a progressive physical recovery even beyond COVID-19. Yeah, we are told that there is really no post-COVID. There's just how you plan beyond COVID-19. So as way of introduction and perhaps just the composition or the current debt status where we are at as a country, as of June 2021, our debt stock stands at 7.7 trillion. And the composition is as you see it here. There's a table showing the external debt, which constitutes about 52% of our public debt, and domestic debt, which covers about 47% of our debt. So one thing you'll notice is, one thing I'd like you to note is that the differences between the multilateral and bilateral amounts, so creditors that we have, as well as the domestic debt, just the commercial banks mostly, and how the changes have been over time. So there is, I think, emphasis to move more into concessional loans, which are a little bit cheaper compared to commercial loans. So I think that is an area that we hope to see addressed in the next budget cycle. Just a second. For some reason, my slides are not moving. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So what really is the problem statement that we're seeing here? From the figures that we see and how this trend has been rising over time, I think from around 2012, 2013, our public debt has been on the rise each financial year. And we think that this continuous rise is becoming unsustainable. And even more importantly, it's too burdensome on the common mwananchi, and particularly in the informal sector. And I'm glad that there will be at least presentation or submission from the informal sector, as Raphael said, because then we can be able to see some of the areas that we need to really mitigate and areas that we need to focus on, just to ensure that we do not leave any sector or any individual behind, even as we plan for next year. So among the effects or consequences that we are seeing with the increase in public debt, or the continuous increase in public debt, of course, is the increased tax obligation. And I think each financial year we see either new tax coming up, or there's a difference, there's a sort of restructuring in the taxes that we have, perhaps to broaden or deepen the tax base. And some of the things that we want to do, that is so that we can collect more revenue to cater for national obligation, including public debt, which is, as we'll see in the next slides, is a really some of the among the first charges on our consolidated fund service. But also other effects will be poor service delivery, because then if you don't have enough amount or most of the amount that you collect really go to servicing debt, then there will be strict or service delivery key sectors like health, education will definitely suffer, because then you don't have enough amount to budget for that in the budget cycle. But also limited resources for development because of the narrow fiscal space, because then you're using a lot of money to pay and service debts, but as well as limited or no accountability on procurement and the use of public debt. Sorry, that is another area that we see is a very, very big problem, because we have all this debt collected annually or borrowed annually, but one, we do not know where the debt or what projects the debt go to fund. There's very limited or close to no accountability really or transparency on the use of this debt. What we see or what we feel as maybe taxpayers is the brutal, repayment of the debt, because then we feel it through the taxation. But in terms of development, we see very few or no accountability at all on development. We've seen, I think, in the past 2 or 3 financial years, the Auditor General has highlighted the issue of pending or stalled projects that we see. But if you remember that these projects are mostly financed by debt, because debt is a big part of the money that we borrow through debt is going to fund infrastructure projects, which include the development projects that we see around. But we do not really see, can I call it return on investment? Because yes, you have all these projects that are happening, but they are stalled. They are either dormant. Some of them, if it's a bridge, if it's maybe a dam, there is grass grown all over it, but there's still amount that is submitted for that project annually or within the annual budget. So I think there is need for more accountability, and especially in the use of public debt in Kenya, because that is one of the big problems that we see. So those are the 2 major problem statements that we have. But just to look at even how do we really get here? How have we gotten where we are at right now? And then the last part of the presentation will be really to just look at some of the propositions. Yeah. So this table, I feel like there's a little bit more recent data on this, but these will serve the purpose for now, because I just wanted to highlight the trends in revenue, expenditure, and fiscal deficit that we've had over the years. And if you look back from 2013, so the parts in red are the deficits. And how deficit arise really is you collect revenue annually, yes, you budget, but the budget or the expenditure that you budget for is always higher than the revenue that you collect as a country. Then that leaves you to, there is a deficit between the amount collected, the annual revenue collected, and the annual expenditure or budgeted expenditure. So that is where debt actually arises from, because that deficit then mostly is funded by debt. Yeah, so that is what you see in red here, and it has been increasing over the years. We've moved from around an average of 0.5% to right now at 0.9%. And I think there are more recent figures on this that will definitely show an increase in deficits. So this is how we really continue to go deeper into the debt crisis or the debt problem that we are facing right now in the country. And the problem here is really, for me, I think it's how we plan, how we plan and how accountable we are to our plans as a government. Sorry, my voice is a little bit low. So just to look at an overview of what we use actually to repay debt annually. Looking back from I think about 2018, which are the actuals, and then 2019, and then we have the projected going forward. So look at this last row on public debt expenses, the total. Then we have, I think, we see an increase over the years, except for, I think, 2018. We see an increase, and even the projected increase. This is the amount that we use annually to repay debt, or projected that we'll use in the next financial years to repay debt. This amount, if you look at it and the revenue that we collect, and the budget that we have budgeted for annually, then it really raises a lot of questions, because then we use a lot of money in repaying debt, and we'll see shortly how, or some very scary figures on how these amounts, or why this amount continue rising. And just looking at it as a percentage of tax revenue. So the first table is really as at 2020, the first half of 2020, but more recent figures, that was at 53%. But more recent figures show that this has increased. And in the first quarter, I think of the first quarter, calendar quarter of 2021, we used up to 67% of tax revenue to repay debt. So this simply means, or 57% of the total revenue. So this really translates to, for every 100 shillings that we collect, then 57 of it goes to repay debt. That is where we were as of March 2021. And we've seen, definitely we've collected, or we've borrowed more since then. So that figure is definitely bound to change. And this is according to the National Treasury figures. But the public debt growth rate is also quite alarming. If you look at the second table, the total public debts in Kenya shillings, in billion Kenya shillings, in 2019-2020, we were at around 768, but we've seen quite a bit of increase to 900. That is just in one financial year, yeah? So you see our debt obligation is increasing at a very alarming rate, yeah? 17%, yeah, 17%. That is in just one financial year. So that really should say something in our budgeting and our plans for the next financial year. Then it means we'll be at a quite bad position if we continue at this rate. And also noting just how close we are to even surpassing or breaching our debt ceiling, which I think there are charters that we have already surpassed right now. Only that the figures that the government is really giving the public are not the exact figures of our debt stock as it is, yeah? Okay, sorry. I wanted to discuss this slide, and as really showing how and why our debt service payment, or our debt service obligation, continues to rise year in, year out. This I borrowed from the recent Control of Budget report as of August 2021. And this is what I was saying, quite scary figures, yeah? So public debt is among the charges on the Consolidated Fund Service. So meaning for whatever amount that we collect as a country, among the first things that we do pay off is debt. So in the current financial year that we're implementing, our Consolidated Fund Service comprised of about 878 billion. Now, out of this 878, 765 went to pay public debt. That is about 80% of that amount went to repay debt. Yeah. And this, of course, is an increase from the previous year, where we used that around 717 billion of the Consolidated Fund collection. But what interests me with this is that out of the amounts that we are saying, the 765, of course, there is domestic and external debt there. But look at the interests, yeah? So for this is for interest on repayment or principal, or for all the amount, the 878, 285 of that went to repay or redemption of principal, the principal amount borrowed, yeah? But 480 of it was on repayment of interest, yeah? So that really says something about the type of debts that we borrow, and even how we negotiate this debt, yeah? Because if more than half the principal amount, more than half the interest, I mean, the interest that we use to repay is more than half the principal amount, then how are we really negotiating our debts as a country? And more alarming is on the domestic, because the external, yes, there is an almost relative ratio of principal amount and interest. But look at the domestic. For the domestic debt repayment, it amounted to about 532 billion. Out of that 532, only 157 was for the principal amount, but 480 was on interest. Yeah. So even when we say we want to move into more domestic borrowing, then what type of these domestic borrowings are we talking about? Are we talking about commercial domestic borrowing where our debt continue to rise because of the stringent terms that are offered by maybe banks or even private lenders? Or how can we then restructure our debt in the next financial year so that we don't see these huge, especially interest repayment? I think that is where a big part of debt servicing really goes to, and how can we restructure that to just ensure that we fall within a reasonable ratio, because countries really do develop out of debt, but then to what extent of debt are we talking about? Yeah. So with that background, these are some of the issues that we think are a concern for us, and the first one is of course the widening gap between budgeted and actual expenditures. So what we budget for is not really what ends up to be the expenditure. There's a very big gap, in as much as it should be a close estimate, a plus or minus kind of close estimate, but we see the differences are too wide, and we see several supplementary budgets come up every year. And I think for me, if we try and just be as realistic as possible in our budget, so that the expenditure is not very far from the budget, I think we'll curb a lot of issues like budgeted corruption, which mostly this second supplementary budget, third supplementary budget that we see come annually, I think that is where really the problem comes in, because then how do you justify all this? And remember, when you're talking about second, third, fourth, whatever supplementary budgets that you're talking about, there is really no public participation in those. Yeah, those are just figures that people sit down and say, no, we want to increase this to this amount, we want to reduce this to this amount. What effect does that have on all the processes that citizens have gone through to just try and, budget for the next financial year, or budget for their needs for the next financial year? Yeah. But also we see overshooting actual expenditure risk, and this raises questions, of course, on whether or even how the composition, the prerequisite of management of financial resources is done by the National Treasury. This is also related to the first point, because then if we see these budgeted and actual expenditures big differences, then how are we really, is our planning really right? Are we planning correctly? And what raises this? Because right now we are talking about covering pretty much every sector. Yeah, but when it gets to the actual expenditure, then the amounts that we see are completely different from what was proposed in the budgets. So I think that is where really there are a lot of accountability issues to be considered. Yeah. But also the ordinary revenue is below the recurrent expenditure over a period of about 4-5 years. Yeah, so this means that part of the recurrent expenditure and the entire development expenditure is being financed through debts. Yeah, so some of the principles that we have under the Public Finance Management Act is that first, there are percentages of budget that can be, for example, budget on infrastructure development shouldn't go beyond 30%. Yeah. But also there are other principles, like you can't borrow to pay recurrent expenditure, because then there is no return on investment. But if we have this very low revenue and very high expenditures over a period of 5 years, then it means we are definitely borrowing to repay recurrent expenditure, which shouldn't be the case. Yeah. So we hope to see this change, at least in the next financial year, such that we have we can justify our expenditures. And even if you look at the next financial, we are budgeting for a lot of other things, including elections. Yeah. So if we have that, but we are borrowing even further, how do we justify that going forward? How are we going to repay that? And also issues of transparency and accountability. I can't emphasize that enough. But also another thing that is quite concerning for us is the issue of debt ceiling. This has come up in a bit of conversations this year. And I know there are talks whether the National Assembly should increase that amount or dispense with it completely. Then that begs the question: then what does it mean for the common taxpayers? Because then the government is likely to borrow limitlessly without really considering the effect that will have on the public, the taxpayers. So with that, moving to my conclusion, these are what we are proposing, really, with the problem statement and how it really arises and some of the concerns that we have. Now, this is what we propose. Number one, minimizing the ratio of commercial debts in our debt structure. So commercial debts are the expensive debts that we see that bring rise to these very high interest rates that we are covering right now. So if we just minimize that and maybe move to more concessional loans, then we might be able to just curb a little bit or a small part of the issue of public debt. But also we need to see a balanced budget. We don't want to see a budget that, we prepare or the proposed figures are very low compared to the expenditure that eventually does happen. Then we want to see that relation not being too far, but also there is need maybe to curb non-priority expenditure, because right now we are looking at a more recovery process. We are not really budgeting for like we could budget prior to COVID-19. Right now we're talking about immunization, we are talking about vaccinations, we're talking about the health sector, the education sector. I know there will be a presentation on the education sector, which has really changed. We are talking about budgeting for election. Then is there really need to look at some sectors that or some budget priorities that are not really needful right now when we're recovering? When you're recovering, you need to look at the things that you are doing very low, and especially the most basic services. But thirdly, and I think most important for me, will be the implementation of the Public Finance Management Act that we have, because the laws are not and hardly the problem in Kenya. It's only the implementation. We have very precise laws that give very precise, even in terms of expenditure, in terms of reporting, transparency, and accountability. But we don't really see that translate into implementation. I think if we did implement that, and Section 15 is a very key section in the Public Finance Management Act, because it has a lot of this, it lays out the principles of public finance management. So if we stick to that, then we will not really be seeing a lot of accountability issues come up. So we are hoping and we're urging that in this financial year that we at least stick to the thresholds and that have been set, and even that the values or accountability issues that have been mentioned in that section. And finally, is the accountability of, again, another section, Section 50, it talks about the limit of debt. We don't want to borrow until we are unable to even justify our borrowing. There are limits that have been set already. So we want to see that actually being implemented in this cycle, so that we do not go far and beyond what we really can manage as a country. Because that then burdens a lot the citizens, and it's not really the high class that are being burdened, it's the informal sector, people that are really feeling the brunt of this. And so I think that one needs to change, and I hope that the informal sector presentation can also capture some of these things and the need to actually have realize a change in that. So Raphael, I think I'll stop there. I hope I was within time. If not, I am really sorry, but that was my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Irene, for your presentation. I think it was very educative in terms of issues to do with public debt management. Before we go to the next presenter, let me mention two things. One is that we do have, I don't want us to have a reaction right now in terms of questioning or even giving comments. We do have a chat box. I'm encouraging participants, maybe what we can do is to post our comments or even any question to any of our presenters. Number two is just to preempt, I don't want to preempt what Irene has just gone through, because what she has done is just to share with us, and it's very educative in terms of the composition of of our public debt, but also important, she has mentioned something to do with CFS, the composition of the consolidated fund services, and given us a very insightful issues in terms of that public debt composition in the CFS constitutes almost around 80%, which is usually a first charge to any money that is being given out by the government. And she has also shared with us some of the proposals that she would like to see implemented by the government, and one of the key issues is on accountability in the implementation of the PFM Act, particularly Section 50, where the debt limits set by Parliament, which actually inform borrowing in any financial year, the Parliament should be able to stick with that. So key issues, and I believe going forward, those are some of the things that we'll be sharing with the National Treasury. So without further ado, I want to invite our second speaker, Mr. Geoffrey Koech, who works with the National Taxpayers Association, to actually share with us some of the focusing. You'll be basically focusing on the social protection, but focusing on affirmative action programs, particularly funding on minorities and marginalized group. So, Mr. Geoffrey Koech, welcome, and you can share your presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Geoffrey Koech. I'm from the National Taxpayers Association. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather, but I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can, please.
Okay, let me share my screen and then I can proceed. Today, I'm going to cover on actualizing affirmative action programs for minorities and marginalized groups. And we get to hear a lot of programs around this area, but what is the impact? And as the National Taxpayers Association, together with a consortium of two other organizations, Kenya Paraplegic Organization, Kenya Female Advisory Organization, we've been working on the marginalized group for quite some time right now. And just to monitor how effective these programs are, and if indeed they meet their functions. And just a little background, we look at the Constitution, Article 43, which bestows upon the government the responsibility to ensure that its citizens have access to the highest sustainable standards of health, access to housing, sanitation, water, and free from hunger. And actually, that is the foundation for social protection in the Constitution. And also, the Constitution was so specific on what type of, on the definition of the minority groups, and also what needs to be done in order to ensure that they benefit from the provision of Article 43. And Article 56 provides that the government shall put in place affirmative action programs that will ensure that they lead a dignified life and are granted special opportunities that will enable them to be productive citizens. Also, by the call from the Treasury, we are also focusing on the Vision 2030, and it's a pillar under the Vision 2030 that the government shall ensure that it promotes and ensures that these minorities get access to subsidized healthcare, and also that the government takes care of the vulnerable and the older people in the society. So just to rush to the situational analysis, which I've mentioned about the project we've conducted with the two other organizations, where we've covered the uptake of NGAF and the AGPO programs, and also the safety net programs being implemented by the government. And the findings, I've shared it, and we have a link there. We can refer to that report later. But the biggest revelation that we bumped into is that the process is rather cumbersome to ensure that the target groups indeed benefit from these programs, and some of the recommendations of which I will cover later on include a lot of civic education, include a lot of capacity building, even in the part of the government, because most officials do not really understand the challenges faced by the minority groups. And also there is that attitude whereby they feel when you interact with the beneficiaries, they have the attitude that they get this attitude from the service providers or the government officials that it's like a favor being done to them by the government. Even when they request for the funds, when the funds are delayed, they get that there is that mindset that he too ni msaada, and really that doesn't sit well with the target groups. So we'll go into the key budget performance issues, and there is a study that has been undertaken by the development initiatives on the social protection sector, and this study covers the past 5 financial years, and when we look at it, you can conclude that there is it has been at a constant of 2% between the financial year 2017 to the financial year 2021-2022, and there was only a marginal increase in the financial year 2018 and 2019, and the government allocation to the social protection programs was they had allocated 172.7 billion to the social protection programs, and it was divided into, they have various programs. There is the Inua Jamii Senior Citizen Scheme. These targets the senior citizens. There is also the cash transfer to orphans and vulnerable children, and there is also the cash transfer to persons with disabilities. And we are going to look at the performance of each of these sub-programs and the allocations. So the overall cash transfers to the most resourced program, which is the cash transfer to older persons, had a budgetary allocation of 43.6%. It was followed by the cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable children, and the hunger safety net program, which accounted for 20.7% and 10.7% respectively. There is a table here. There's a graph on the allocation in the past 5 financial cycles, and we can see it has been steady on the 2% for the past 5 years, and we will see there was a reduction when there was the COVID pandemic, because government had to do some restructuring on its finances, and we'll see the effect of that. So there's also the table on the allocation of social protection budget by ministries, departments, and agencies. This is between the 5 years. The State Department for Social Protection had a budgetary allocation of 69.6%. And we look at its performance as we go through the presentation. There was the cash transfer to person with disabilities, which remained at a constant of 1.2 billion between those 5 cycles. And it was reduced substantially, of course, with the COVID pandemic, which I've already mentioned it. And it was there was an increase of the 36.9 to provide more resources to support vulnerable groups. However, the increased funding mainly went to cash transfer for older persons, and we can see there is I don't want to call it discrimination or anything, but you see there was a reduction from the allocation of persons living with disability, and it was channeled to older persons. That was through the budgetary allocation to the State Department for Social Protection. However, the person is to account for between 2.2% and 15% of Kenya's population. That is a huge number of people. But when you look at the allocation, it doesn't really satisfy that population. So one of the recommendations is that we have a targeted approach in ensuring that the allocation to persons with disabilities is increased, because from the presentation we can see that preference has been dedicated to older persons or the senior citizens. I'm not suggesting that we divert now from the older citizens. We can maintain the allocation for the older citizens and also increase the allocation for persons with disabilities. And we look at the effects of failure to increase on the recommendation part. And also we can see that access to persons with disability cash transfer is limited to only households living in extreme poverty and having a member with extreme disability. That is another aspect of discrimination, because the parameters that are put in place to set aside persons with disability, to that this one is an extreme case and this one is not an extreme case, it's neither here nor there. There is need to educate this target group on not the target group, the duty bearers on that aspect, because to us it cuts as a discriminatory policy. And accordingly, many persons with disability who are in need of assistance are excluded from the program. For instance, in the financial year 2019-2020, only 37,104 households accessed the cash transfer for persons with disability. And you see, the estimated number of persons with disability in Kenya is between 2.2% and 15%. The Kenyan population right now, we are approaching 45 million Kenyans. So you can imagine only 37,000 households benefited. You can imagine the number that was left out. There was also the complementary services, and there was a previous publication on development initiatives. The funding that supports disability inclusion in Kenya showed that the annual budget allocations to National Development Fund for Persons with Disabilities remained at a constant 259 million between the financial year 2016-2017 to 2019-2020. And then we look at the aspect of it was reduced to 200 million, which was further reduced by half to 100 million in the first supplementary budget made in April 2021. In the financial 2021 budget was also doubled to 200. There is that fluctuation, and this creates uncertainty. And also, if there were programs running, it will run at a risk of stopping or altering the whole process. Because when you look at the complementary services, these include integration into the education system. We were looking at there is a project we conducted on the vocational training institutes, and we're looking at how, because from statistics that we have from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, we saw that many people living with disabilities are in the rural areas, and we are all well aware that vocational training is now a function of the county governments, and there is a rush to implement that function by the county governments. But where the problem is that the county governments are only focusing on brick and mortar. They just set up a building, and this is where the complementary services are supposed to come in. Are the building accessible to persons with disabilities? Are the tutors sensitive, or are the tutors trained to handle and deliver content to persons with disabilities? And with the fluctuation in the budgetary allocation, it is difficult for a steady or a progressive inclusion of persons with disabilities in education system, the health sector, and all the other sectors in the country. I've said much about the allocation to older persons, and the performance is not that bad. But we are all aware of which we've mentioned about the debt and everything. And the key challenge comes in the allocation, because we can allocate the money, we can have targets, but without the money, it is difficult to actualize what has been set forth. There was also the cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable children. It remained at a constant of 8 billion annually between the financial 2017-2021 as a proportion to the State Department for Social Protection budget. The percentage going to the cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable declined to 18% in the financial 2019-2020, gaining back some loss in the financial 2020 and 2021. The Social Protection Department plans to provide cash transfers to 540,500 households with orphans and vulnerable children. That is a 38.4% increase compared to the target of the financial year 2021. And now this is the challenge. It cuts out as an ambitious plan, because it has not been supported by an increase in budget allocation to reach more households in the 2021-2022. And also, there was the issue of the targeted approach to be adopted by the cash transfer to orphans and vulnerable children. And that's the reason is the research has shown that defining childhood vulnerability in terms of orphanhood and living with a parent with chronic illness may potentially lead to exclusion of children who, despite having both parents, are more vulnerable than their orphaned peers. The greatest challenge in these affirmative action programs is the policies that are in place, the human resource, and the lack of technical know-how on coming up with an approach that indeed will satisfy the need of the target groups. And that is a policy issue, and we can look at some of the proposals and the justification. From our research and the projects that we've implemented, when you look at the sectors like the taxation under the Persons with Disabilities Act 2003, Section 35(1) provides that there be a tax exemption, that is the payee, by persons with disability. And from statistics, we can see that only a few people are benefiting from that that program, because when you look at the bulk of persons with disabilities, most of them are in an informal sector. So with the exemption on pay, it really does not satisfy them or meet that requirement compared to the number that is in the formal sector. So we were proposing that we increase the scope to cater for caregivers. And you can look at a caregiver who's in formal employment, and he or she is taking care of an individual with disability. If there can be a policy change to ensure that the caregiver benefits from the exemption, so that he or she spares the extra cash to cater for persons with disability. Because when you look at the allocation, we are looking at 34,000 households. You can imagine how many households have individuals living with disability, yet they are not even benefiting from Section 35 of the Act. So that is one of the policy recommendations that we are having on that aspect. It will definitely have an impact on collection of pay as you earn, and I don't think KRA will always find a way of filling that deficit, because it will go a long way in actualizing the government's programs, because the government cannot meet each and every individual in the program. So this one will be one of the ways it ensures it actualizes the affirmative action programs. Okay, under the education sector, what we've talked about, the complementary services. we are talking about increased budgetary allocation, especially to vocational training, is to acquire equipment and construct buildings that are sensitive to students with disabilities. And on top of that, we are also proposing training or even hiring of tutors with knowledge on content delivery to persons with disability. That will go a long way in ensuring inclusion of persons with disability in the educational sector. In the health sector, the same thing, because we find an individual with maybe hearing impairment visiting the doctor. He or she has to accompany himself with a sign language interpreter at his own cost. You see, now that creates a problem and also burdens the persons with disabilities. So we are proposing that the Ministry of Health adopts the approach of hiring or even training nurses so that they can serve this. Instead of hiring a sign language interpreter and a nurse, maybe we encourage nurses to take up these courses and doctors so that we can have inclusivity in the health sector. And under the social protection, we are looking at the cash transfer to persons with disability where they receive 2,000 per month. And we are looking at currently with the 2,000, we can imagine the cost of living. Is it really enough? So despite the financial challenges we find ourselves as a country, if we really move from the ambitious nature of focusing on infrastructure development to social protection, we can spare more funds to allocate to these vulnerable individuals and these households so that we can have an increase from the 2,000, which is currently allocated per month, to at least a figure around 5,000, which will go a long way in ensuring that persons living with disabilities are well catered for. And finally, we look at the trade and industrialization. As I had already mentioned previously, that the majority of persons with disability are from rural areas, and they are found in the informal sector. The challenge that these individuals face is that they are expected to pay the business licenses and fees as similar to their counterparts who are not living with disability. And this disadvantages them, because you can imagine, before an individual with a disability sets up a shop, before he goes to the market, how much has he spent on the road? He cannot be, it is difficult for him or her to keep up with an individual who's not living with disability. And so if Section 35 of the Person Living with Disability Act provides for an exemption on payee, we need a national policy that will ensure that traders, and as I've mentioned, majority of individuals with disabilities are working in the informal sector. If you can have a policy that will exempt them or even subsidize the fees paid by them in order to get the business licenses and whatnot, it will go a long way in ensuring that they have indeed been they have been included in the economic development, and this will ensure they really leverage on the provisions of Article 43 and Article 56 of the Constitution. I end my presentation there.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your presentation. I think you have actually covered most of the issues under social protection, particularly on focusing on the affirmative funds, which benefits the minorities and the marginalized. And again, issues to do with budget performance, I think you have covered adequately in terms of how the national government, through its ministries and agencies, allocate resources toward the minorities and the marginalized. And then you have shared with us quite a number of proposals, which you as an institution think that they would benefit the marginalized and and the marginalized and the minorities in our community. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I would wish now to invite Amos. Amos is the research manager for the People's Action for Running Network. And I know more or less they'll be covering almost the same issues with Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa. So Amos, karibu sana, and you can share your presentation.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Yes.
Good morning.
Yeah, as you correctly put it, there is much that will be shared that we agree with Dr. Manyasa. So just allow me to get my presentation. It's very brief. Because all of us, we have interacted with the education sector, and even the two previous presenters have said a lot about education. Now, this landscape of education is, we know how it has operated. Education has received one of the highest budget allocations, of course, in terms of the real money. But if you look at the comparison with the GDP, this has also been declining over the last 1 decade. So, but this morning, I don't want to speak anything that is personal, but just to get to ask for accountability on what government has promised, and therefore asking that should be what we see in the next year's budget. And probably it's just one big proposal that we need to hold government to account for what it has committed itself. So I've pulled this one out of the task force report on the implementation of the curriculum reforms. And what is striking when you begin reading the report are the numbers, particularly when we walk to the mysterious year 2023, that stakeholders have opined that it's one of the most unpredictable years in the education calendar. Some have equated it to 1985, but probably the scale and magnitude is a bit bigger, because if you look at the numbers involved, they're a bit higher than what we saw in mid-80s when 844 was being launched. So the task force, in its own words, concludes that the year 2023 will see a 27% increase in secondary school learner population from what is estimated to be 4.3 million to 6.29. That is about 1.6 million children. And this will be occasioned by two things. One, the transition of grade 6 to grade 7, which is considered to be the first year of the junior secondary school, and then transition of class 8 into Form 1 secondary school. So what does this basically mean in our conservative budgeting process? What demands does it place? So just 3 pointers: that increased need for development expenditure will be required to expand the infrastructure in the secondary schools for the 27% increase. Because we know that enrollment and placement is a factor of population or of numbers. Numbers play the biggest role, although there are also other factors, but that is the main driver. And so this 27%, it's not proportional to the increase in the infrastructure, but there is a level to which one has to configure for it to match. But also you realize that there will also be increased recurrent expenditure due to the teacher remuneration, because by domiciling a junior secondary school in the existing secondary school, it means that you need teachers with a slightly higher qualifications as such, because you wouldn't be taking the P1 teachers to take them to the secondary schools as such. So probably you need teachers with higher qualifications. The good thing is that we have a significant number of teachers in primary schools who already have degrees and diplomas and such, and therefore it will be possible to reorganize this resource. But that will also mean that there will be a serious deficit created in the primary school if you have to take that approach. Now, it also means that you have to think about the capitation grants, because currently we give about 1,450 shillings per child in primary school. but it's about 23,000 for children in secondary schools. But also look at the demands of the new curriculum, even in terms of the learning areas that are created. Currently, we have 7 in primary school. CBC has taken them up to around 9. That means also a sharp increase by 2, because if you have to provide textbooks, then it means for every 1 million children, you take an average of about 400 million. In addition, just to textbooks, you're timetabling for time, which means you're also increasing allocations to the workload for the teachers and such. And yet also that curriculum designed from a quality point increases more demands, that even the ratio of 1 to 40 is sometimes too high for these teachers. Now, remuneration in secondary school is about, the capitation in secondary school is about 23,000. That means that if you have this 1.6 transiting to go to secondary school, then what you used to spend on average of this child is 2,900 for the 2 years. They would have been in grade 7 and grade 8 in primary school, is now supposed to go higher by about 16 times. That means that again now each of this average child you now be spending about 47,000. So this also has to be factored in the next year's budget. Now, you also need to realize that there is a resource imbalance in the primary school, as I've mentioned. And so this surplus will not necessarily be commensurate to the deficit in secondary schools, because when you create a secondary school, there will be new demands. And the new demands include things such as laboratories. The number of subjects have gone higher and such. And some of these subjects are also new. So it means that you just can't take the existing teachers and take them to start training. And I'll be illustrating some of these new subjects and what they therefore portend as demands for a seamless transition. Now, the task force went ahead to actually identify 12 things. I don't need to read through them because this is the basis of how they made the decision. Now, what will it therefore do in terms of realizing universal secondary education, which seems to be what we have a constitutional commitment, that every child must have free and compulsory basic education, for which you would define to be 12 years of continued learning. What does it therefore mean for us to universalize? And every child therefore gets this access. Now, in a long time, this country has, there will basically be 2 approaches, one which is access driven, and the other one which is quality driven universalization. But we seem to have taken the conservative approach since time immemorial, where we go by the numbers, just access. Let them get something. That is what we seem to take. And therefore, this is marginal increase in terms of existing resources without necessarily altering the fundamentals, because you really won't want to focus on what NTA have been presenting on some of the groups that are highly marginalized and left out, and what will really be opportunities that they need for them to favorably participate in the education process and therefore get meaningful outcomes that are able to allow them to thrive later on in life. If education has to continue playing the equalization function, even play a critical role in terms of optimizing potentials that people have. So what does it basically mean? So you really can't take an access-based approach, and for which proponents of CBC argue that CBC comes to cure such. But then what does it mean if you have to take such? It will mean that you have to think about the resource configuration frameworks. Can one teacher serve 40 children? Do you still need to have a classroom of 40 children? Do you still need just to talk about 2 acres of a piece of land? And, the timetable as it is situated. What is the role of households? How do you optimize participation by non-state actors? And basically, how do you just also reduce wastage in terms of the resources already available to education and such? What does it basically mean for you to think about a quality-based universalization of secondary education? Now, what 2023 therefore means, and as I've said, I've decided not to speak anything that is an opinion, but just to present what the demands are, because that request is pretty simple, but it's very big for government to achieve. So if you're going to realize the CBC intention, which has a very, very ambitious mission of nurturing every learner's potential, And junior secondary is going to play a critical role because it's at the point at which now children are prepared to take on the different pathways. Then that means that those fundamentals must be found right and must really be found to be sound if really you want to achieve the fundamentals of, the intentions of CBC. Otherwise, you'll have a false start. You can imagine a situation where if you are to put children in schools and they have three pathways of CBC is designed, and that means that by the end of the 3 years, you need really to be sure that this child belongs to the talent, this child belongs to STEM, and this child belongs to technical. Because this is basically, JSS is basically like a laboratory. This is where you get to screen and determine, not even screening, actually, this is where you get to do the diagnosis of where to do placement, because screening is a bit different. It's light, you want us to tell you certain features, but is this diagnosis sure of what you are going to prescribe as a pathway? And remember, they leave junior secondary at 16, some of them at 15, because we've seen a system that is very ambitious, even allowing 4-year-olds to join grade 1. So that means that you'll have children about 14, 15 now beginning to choose career path. And if they're going to live in these careers for the rest of their lives, then you really need to be sure that you've made the right decisions for them. Therefore, junior secondary is no joke. It's not the way we've designed and implemented grade 1, 2, and 3, and now middle school, grade 4 and grade 5 and grade 6. This is not going to be the case. So it has to be designed very, very well, and it has to be implemented in what Professor Lonyangapola have said, meticulously. So one must think of it that way. So what is there for the implication? As I've said, basically, if you use the current computations, it means that you need an additional 37 billion allocation on the bare minimum in terms of capitation per child. If you go with the current trends, which we know even from the Kilemi Media Task Force report, that this is still not sufficient for us to provide meaningful education. And don't forget that it is 23,000 within the framework of fewer subjects. Now you even increasing those number of subjects. What does it mean if you to bring in additional children and such? Then it will mean that you also have to recruit additional teachers. This mysterious number, where we also always read in the budget statement that the government will recruit an additional 10,000 teachers, without underscoring that this is partly replacing those who have exited the system because of natural attrition, resignations which are very minimal, retirements which of course leads, and a few also cases of those who die and those who perhaps are forced to leave because of disciplinary action and such. That's one thing that the commission will never admit. So it cannot be business as usual of recruiting the additional 10,000. If government wants to achieve the intention of CBC, and even it goes to the conventional approach of 40 children per learner, then it must be looking at an additional 40,000 teachers that it needs to recruit. And this is not even quality-based approach where you are now to look at the specifics. This is just looking at the nominal numbers. Divide the 1.6, divide by the number of teachers you need. So we're not even looking at areas which are critical. Think about, you want to establish talent. So you need to train teachers, you need to ensure that, then you have to think about training teachers for the new areas, as I've mentioned, pre-technical. We're introducing things such as career education, health education, business, agriculture, and life skills. So you can see that we do not have a surplus of these skills readily available. So what plans do we have between now and by then, just to ensure that either there is rapid testing of teachers, but we already just do rapid testing of teachers. These are very, very practical oriented, and we just have about 9 months now to the new year. And somebody, so there is a lot of demands that comes with just preparing teachers to be ready for them to implement CBC in junior secondary. And of course, lastly, you also have to think about the classrooms. You are not going to run away from that fact. Now, the greatest challenge this country faces that up to right now is still not have a school infrastructure policy, which defines what is school infrastructure, what size of land, and such. And so it's, as we speak now, there is no audit of the exact number of classrooms that we have, just the numbers alone. Yes, that data is somewhere in EMIS, one could find it. But then there's also the idea of functionality of the infrastructure that you have, because it's one thing to have what sometimes we can't include those mabati shanties, it includes the mud structures, etc. But is that what is necessary to deliver this quality education? So if you have to think about what kind of infrastructure is needed, and let's just again go back to the bare minimums of using what we need. And according to the NCDF, I think it costs an average of about 750,000 to construct a classroom. Now, the president had a very good idea last year that we need to think about bringing down the cost of infrastructure and also invest in what we call classrooms for the future, which are going to use slightly different materials and therefore make infrastructure to be a bit more sustainable than what we have right now. And the statement is that that will bring down the cost of infrastructure by about 20%, which is very critical because infrastructure remains one of the biggest challenges because it's always passed on to parents. Huh? If you walk to most schools, without exception of CDF, parents are perpetually paying what used to be called PTA levies just to construct classrooms, and so that burden is always offloaded to the parents. So you're basically saying that you need to construct another close to 40,000 classrooms without looking at the ones that are aging that need to be replaced. This is just addition. And if with 750,000, now if you reduce that, so you need to inject in close to another 27 billion to achieve. But also don't forget also the pressure that this will also introduce to households, because when households have children going all the way to grade 8, that means that the investments needed in primary school were a bit lower. But now for these 2 years that you've now taken the children to secondary school, that means that the expectations on the part of the parents also go up, especially when you think about domiciling a junior secondary school in secondary schools. And where there's also a mismatch, it's not that maybe every village or every ward has a secondary school. So if you look at maybe almost all villages in Kenya will be having a primary school, but there is that imbalance in terms of what is available at the secondary school level. So it means that yes, on the part of government there is strain, but also on the part of the ordinary people. That means increased spending on the part of these households that are already struggling inside. So our proposal is basically simple, that government keeps to its own commitment, because this is their own report. These are the demands that the report brings. It's government decisions to domicile CBC junior secondary in secondary school, and it's the intention of government to deliver CBC which nurtures every learner's potential. And therefore, please go ahead and implement your own commitments. That is our proposal this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amos, for your insightful presentation. And I don't want to actually even comment more before the next presenter, but one of my comments is, and I agree with you, that this is a government report and that the government should account on what it has committed to do, particularly on CBC. So I would like to invite, I know time is not on, I indicated that you are going to add, and I can see time is not on our side. I would like to invite Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa to quickly share with us his proposals. Thank you and welcome, Dr.
Thank you. I am going to pick up from where Amos left. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I am just going to pick up from where Amos left. I think he has done most of what we needed to do. We did not compare notes, but because we are coming from the same background, what we are sharing is in many ways similar. So let me share my screen and just quickly go through. Are you able to see my screen?
Oh, it's coming up.
Okay. Let me know when you can see it so that I don't assume that people are seeing what I'm talking about when they are not. Is it there?
Yeah, it is now there.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to just take us through quickly a few things that I think we need to reflect on as we go into this budget cycle, starting with very simple motivation that for a long time Kenya has had this challenge of access, quality, equity, and relevance of education. And in an effort to address this, we have come up with many interventions, from free primary education to free day secondary education, and now to 100% transition, which we are trying to implement to make sure that we have all children accessing, and not just accessing, but accessing quality education in an equitable manner. And now the latest intervention that we have, which everyone is aware of, is CBC, which we are trying to implement in the hope that this will help us to achieve the aspiration of SDG 4, to which we have committed as a country, which is to make sure that all children equitably access quality education and lifelong learning opportunities. But we know that there are setbacks. Many of those are policy practice translation issues, so that there is a policy, but translating that policy into practice is where lots of those challenges lie. But there is also financing challenges, which is what Amos has talked about, and which is what I'm also going to focus on, given that we are talking about pre-budget and we are trying to input thoughts into the budget making process. There are several issues that I feel are critical if we are going to successfully transit into CBC. So one of those issues is the design of the curriculum. We know that there is CBC framework, but we have to design the curriculum for every level, for every grade. And so that is a challenge that is still there, that is facing issues of financing, either in terms of the volume of financing or also the timeliness of the financing. We have the issue of teacher provision and preparation, and Amos has referred to this in great detail. There has been the notion, when you listen to a lot of people in the sector talking about, all teachers are already trained, is just reorienting teachers. That is not entirely true, because some of the learning areas, as Amos has pointed out, are new, and those areas require that we provide teachers with relevant skills to be able to teach them. They are new areas. We can't say we will reorient a teacher who has never been trained in those areas to be able to provide those services. We also must appreciate that there are challenges with the numbers of teachers. Numbers of teachers have consistently been low, and somehow we have managed to survive with those low numbers, with classrooms of 60 to 70 pupils per teacher. CBC as designed will not be able to function in that kind of an environment. So providing enough teachers has now become an urgent problem. It has always been a problem. It has become an urgent problem now that must be attended. And then we have the issue of infrastructure development. These are the three, in my view, three key issues that need to be addressed in terms of financing for us to be able to successfully transition from the current system to the CBC. So if you look at the budget for the last 3 years, starting 2019, 2020 to 2021, 2022, you will see that funding for KICD has been increasing, but at an average of less than 5% per annum per budget cycle. What this means is that our funding priorities do not reflect the demands that we have placed on KICD of designing the new curriculum at the different levels. And the consequence of that has been that every year KICD is only able to design, to produce designs for one level. So right now we are implementing grade 5, we are producing designs for grade 6. By the time they are produced, we will be starting grade 6. There will not have been sufficient time for the teachers to familiarize themselves with those designs. There will not have been sufficient time to train teachers in those designs and for them to familiarize themselves enough to be able to implement them well. And that's why you hear a lot of the outcry that is there. People are saying teachers are not interpreting the designs properly. But the teachers have not had time with these designs because they are coming out when the year that they ought to be implemented is starting. One would expect that KICD will have received funding for designing of all these levels of the curricula in good time, so that they are in place in good time. Teachers have enough time to be trained and they are able to familiarize themselves with the designs way ahead of implementation. So that is an area that requires funding. If you look at what KICD is receiving and look at what is demanded of KICD, then we are putting them on the edge in terms of what they are able to accomplish and when they can be able to accomplish it. And that is a challenge for implementation of CBC. The second issue has to do with the funding for teacher training that TSC is receiving. If you look at the funding that they are receiving for in-service teacher training, it is also averaging less than 5% increment annually. And if you take into account the numbers of teachers who need to be prepared to implement CBC, and those who need to be retooled, and the fact that they need to actually hire new teachers in large numbers to be able to implement the new curriculum and meet its expectations, then the changes in the budget do not reflect the urgency with which we need to increase the number of teachers and with which we need to train those teachers in readiness to implement the new curriculum. So that is another issue. Funding for teacher training, especially to TSC, and also teacher recruitment is not reflecting the urgency of the problem at hand. The funding to the Ministry of Education for infrastructure development. If you look at the budgetary figures this year, they have reflected a slight increment. But if someone asked me the increment in what has been shown in the budget would be useful if we were just addressing the issue of 100% transition, because already 100% transition has caused congestion in secondary schools that is unimaginable. Congestion in dormitories, in classrooms, that is quite big. And so when you listen again to the people in the ministry, they will tell you, you know, not all schools are lacking classrooms because some of the schools have classrooms that are not in use. That is true. Alliance Girls High School, for example, is one of the schools that has some empty classrooms. But why are there empty classrooms? Because there is a teacher shortage. So they have been unable to utilize the right ratio of 40 learners to a teacher in a classroom because they have no teachers. So they have combined some of the classrooms to have 60 and therefore leave some of the classrooms empty. So if you say we do not have an infrastructure problem in that school, you may be right to some extent, but you have a teacher problem in that school, which still requires a budget for you to resolve. But more importantly, I mentioned that this increase that has been seen in the current financial year will be only helpful if we were dealing with the issue of 100% transition and not the double intake in 2023 and 2024. Because if you look at a school like Alliance Boys High School, this year they have 9 streams of Form 1. if they have 9 streams of Form 1, for them to have a double intake in 2023, they require 18 streams of Form 1. That means they require 9 additional classrooms. If you look at the amount that has been allocated in the current financial year, the 4.2 billion shillings, that amount can only create 3,500 classrooms across the country as per the Ministry of Public Works guidance of 1.2 million per classroom. Those are not enough to give every secondary school in Kenya 1 classroom. Alliance, if they receive 1, they will still be in deficit of 8 classrooms to be ready for January 2023 double intake. That is why, and this is where we actually have the greatest threat to successful transition into CBC. What is our proposal? We need to increase funding in 2022-2023 financial year to fund the following items. 1, to speed up designs for the different levels of the curriculum, because we have actually been saying we want teacher training colleges to be able to factor CBC into the teacher preparation for pre-service teachers. For them to do that, all the curriculum designs for the levels that these teachers are going to teach need to be ready before TTCs and other teacher training colleges can be able to actually factor this into pre-service teacher preparation. Right now, they're not there. We are still creating 1 level at a time, and that is a big challenge. The fact also that we haven't created these designs means that by the time children are getting into junior secondary school, we may still have no clear idea on how we are going to do talent identification, and therefore which kind of teacher we need to be teaching in junior secondary school to help us identify the pathways for these learners. And if we are not able to identify the pathways, and I heard the director KICD make a statement that was not very good from where I sit, that we know 60% of the learners will transit to regular school in senior secondary, and 25% will go to technical school, and 15% will go to talent. That will defeat the purpose of, or at least the confessed purpose of CBC, because the confessed mission of CBC is to enable every learner to be able to follow their own pathway as per their talents. How we have determined that 60% of them will actually fall in the regular school is a miracle. It's not supposed to be the case. We are supposed to be able to identify them once they're in junior secondary school, but that requires us to have the designs ready in good time, understand which kind of teacher we need, which competencies that teacher will require, so that we have these teachers available in junior secondary schools in 2023, so that they can help us to start to plan for senior secondary in good time, knowing on average, how are the figures looking like? How many children will require to go to talent academies? And therefore, how many talent academies do we need to set up in the country, because they are going to be resource intensive? How many learners will need to go to technical streams of senior secondary? And therefore, how many such schools will need to set up, because they are also going to be resource intensive. And they are also going to require that we prepare tutors for those levels. So that is, to me, very critical. We need to see a robust funding for KICD to speed up curriculum designs in good time. Second is to get the number of teachers, to fund TSC to hire the number of teachers, and also hasten in-service training of the teachers already employed, because this is critical. We will not realize, and I don't need to emphasize this because Amos already made it very clear, we cannot be able to implement successfully CBC without changing the learner-teacher ratios that we have had for a long time. Number 3, we need to expand both physical and ICT infrastructure in secondary schools to cater for the expected double intake in 2023 and 2024. And the reason I bring in the issue of ICT infrastructure is because if we had robust ICT integration in education, as had been envisaged in the strategy of 2006, at this moment, maybe our worries about physical infrastructure will not be so much, because we'll be able to leverage ICTs to fill the gaps where we find physical infrastructure being inadequate. At the moment, we have a big challenge. Consistently, we haven't funded the preparation, the ICT integration into education. We haven't funded it sufficiently, especially teacher preparation to use ICTs has not been well funded, and the infrastructure is not adequately available. So we need to fund that alongside funding physical infrastructure expansion. And finally, I think that we need to fund the establishment of a standing task force to oversee the implementation of CBC, and to have this task force run until the current grade 5 complete university. Part of the problems bedeviling the implementation of CBC right now is because we thought that this was a destination. Implementation has been treated as a destination. We finished with the processes, now we are at implementation, so we are at a destination. But implementation for me is a process of learning. There are very many challenges that are going to be coming up because no one has implemented CBC here before. So everyone involved is learning. We need to have a framework through which the learning can happen. The feedback can be received from those who are implementing, those who are being directly impacted, the children, the parents, the teachers. This framework needs to be there to be responsive and to be flexible, to be able to troubleshoot all the challenges that are going to come along. And so for me, I think that a task force needs to be funded, established, to respond almost in real time to the challenges that are going to be emerging as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emmanuel Imanyara, for your presentation. I think it is very clear. And I do want to synthesize what you have just shared. But what is coming out clearly from both the presentation from Amos and Dr. Imanyara is that there is the whole issue that we need to focus on in terms of financing challenges of the competence-based curriculum. Number two is the question of the level of preparedness that we had when the government decided to implement CBC, and then the whole issue of the demands that comes with the implementation of CBC. So I think those are some of the issues that are coming out from those critical presentation. I've gone through the chat box and I haven't seen any comments. Neither have I seen any. Yes, I have seen one. But before then, before we go to the plenary, I would like to invite Ridian from Crown Trust, just to share with us some insight on women economic empowerment and some of the proposals perhaps they would like being shared with the National Treasury. And I would like to give you just only around 5 minutes, just giving highlights so that we can have another perspective in terms of women economic empowerment. And I know this one falls under the social protection sector. So Ridian, if you are still with us, you can actually share with us in 5 minutes. Just share with us 5 minutes some of the issues to do with women economic empowerment. Ridian, are you still with us? Yeah.
Thank you so much for giving me this chance. Fortunately, I think the presenters who are there before have already given a background to the sectors that we were also looking at. But as you've mentioned, just some perspectives or maybe on some areas that were not mentioned, I will just go through it.
Vivian, we are losing you, or is it on my end?
Okay, I don't know what's happening on my end. Okay, I think you can see my screen now. You can see my screen?
Not yet. Yes, it's coming up. Yes.
Okay. So the proposals that we have from Crown and also from the National Women's Steering Committee on the social protection, culture and recreation sector, a bit on the education and also on the health. And one of the observations that we looked at is that there is a case of inadequate resourcing in the care areas, the care economy, and which has rightly been addressed on the affirmative action funds. And we've seen also the reduction of funding to the State Department of Gender, which is an issue that also needs to be looked into, because from previous years it was still under resourced 4.5 billion. Now we are looking at 3.66 billion. The other thing is on registration of agpo farms. We've seen a reduction in agpo farms where we were looking at 104 farms. Now we are looking at 42,000 farms. So just looking at that as a reform area, that's a key area to look into. The other thing is just resourcing on informal sector, where we have 83% contributing to the employment in the country. And we know that 64.5% is coming from women. So and a majority of young people within that age group of 24 to 35. So there's also a need to look into that. So our proposals are on both the economic front as well as the affirmative action and the mainstreaming. In regards to affirmative action, we are looking at scaling up of the orphans and vulnerable children cover. Right now we are covering 26,000, and the children under 18 years are 3.6 million. So there is definitely a deficit. And also, as Joyfrey mentioned, the allocation of bursaries to children with disabilities. And we also add the issue of assistive learning devices and cash transfer to persons with disability. The other thing that we noticed is the targets. There's a gap in regards to targets.
Vivian, are you able to move your slides from your end?
I'm actually moving them.
They are not
know.
moving from this.
Okay. I'll stop sharing and then share again. If it does not work, maybe I'll just speak through because of time.
Okay, it's okay. Vivian, we are losing you again.
I'm here now.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Can you see?
It is loading. Yes, it is there now.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Fine. Yes, I was talking about the gender mainstreaming part of it. One of the things that we noticed is about GBV, the allocations to GBV, which is an issue that has been raised so many times. So we are lacking a good coverage of counties that are in regards to having programs, having adequate budgeting around that, because the current target says 4 counties, yet we really have so many hotspot counties. And also in regards to the rise in GBV because of COVID-19 effects, that's also an area that we felt that could be better resourced. There was suggestion about having a gender-based violence fund, given that it's cutting across so many counties, and also the not just developing of a national policy, but also the monitoring of a national policy on prevention and responses to GBV. The other thing is on how we are allocating resources to SGBV survivors, which is not provided for under the program-based budgets. So we felt that that's an area that needs to be also looked into, as well as service provision in regards to safe houses and shelters and other referral services. In regards to gender and socio-economic empowerment, one of the things that we noted, AGPO is actually most sensitized, and also there's uptake in the urban areas. Nairobi has about 76% registered farms, and the other rural areas, we've noticed that there's a gap. So we need increased resources and targets as well on training of women entrepreneurs in AGPO, as well as persons with disabilities, which is 4%. And then in regards to conducting of financial and entrepreneurship training support, we know this has been and has also been reported in some of our reports and even other broad-based reports, that financial literacy training on entrepreneurship, which is the backbone of where a lot of employment comes in, has been under-resourced. So if we can also capitalize on this, just building the capacity of entrepreneurs, especially women and marginalized groups, which is where they are, and there are fewer barriers to entry into business, that will be a good plus. Same to increasing allocations on the Women Enterprise Fund and the Wealth Fund. In regards to gender, county, and county, sub-county activities, one of the things we recommended is the use of expertise in conducting this gender responsive monitoring and planning, because that's one thing that's also missing. And we need gender audits and analysis to inform the plans, because one of the challenges in regards to the budget is the plans are not a reflection, the budgets are not a reflections of the planning and the demographics. So this will help in looking at gaps and even opportunities, and also monitoring the progress. Another key thing which we have realized in our work is the lack of increased awareness creation, which I think all of you are aware about. But this has also not been really resourced, because there is such a big information gap on affirmative action funds, leading to the low uptake. I will mention the challenges. I think I'll just keep the challenges and then just go to the health sector. One of the things that we wanted to bring out is the non-communicable diseases, the rise of it, and even the nexus with the reproductive health, and just how the preventive and promotive health program has such big deficits, yet it has a big potential to reduce the burden in the future and also in the economy. So just increasing allocation to prevent, not just to treat or to cure, but to prevent non-communicable diseases will help us. And we've also seen in regards to the COVID-19, the way non-communicable diseases are accelerating the COVID-19 complications. So this is an area where we are seeing a record of 70% in informal settlements having non-communicable diseases. So it really requires an intervention. In regards to reproductive, maternal, neonatal, child and adolescent health at RAMCA, we find that we are not engaging community health workers as they need to. The targets are really low, and because we know that community health workers are the accelerator of information and the bridging of the information gap, whether in an era of COVID or whether in new mothers and new diseases. We need to really enhance the capacity of community health workers. And then the other thing is to just have allocation of standalone budgets under reproductive health, that it's clear even to monitor. The other thing is also on the environmental health. It was raised that we still have counties that have not been declared open defecation free, an example is Kwale, and if you look at the targets, that they are at 50%. So I think this is also an area that can be looked into, because in this day and age, I think there is need for more investment in the WASH project, and especially to curb the issue of infections. Maybe I'll mention a challenge on the out-of-pocket expenditure. I think we've all seen with the many harambes and the many initiatives to raise funds for COVID-19 related complications amidst communicable diseases. So that is an emerging issue and a challenge. On education, yes, we do have the 100% transition from primary school, and we've seen an increase in the number of females from 48.1% to 50.9%. So that we are happy that this is going on, but still a 0.8% of girls who are not able to join Form 1, who join Form 1 are not able to complete Form 4. And then also, so just looking into that, what are we doing about that? And also because of the teenage pregnancies, and what policies do we have for teenage mothers to access or to have a specialized allocation for them to support their education, and even the targets to reach out to them, especially with 2020 being a year where we saw the large increase in teenage pregnancies. The other thing is to look at adult literacy. We've seen this as a challenge, and it's affecting women organizing. It's affecting women coming together for microfinancing. So adult literacy still remain, with 3.8 million female Kenyans who being that they have never been to school or a learning institution. So it's something that we also need to check on, because the targets are about reaching 220 persons. The other thing is on WASH, compliance and investments to water, sanitation and hygiene to combat COVID-19 in schools, because we know there is a new reality, and we need also plans, not just for infrastructure, but also infrastructure that is corresponding to COVID-19 prevention. And the site, the spacing that is allowed in, to ensure that there is safety of the students. I will mention about the infrastructure. It's been mentioned. I would also like to just point as an area to look into as a trend. It's the lack of role modeling and sensitization on STEM courses, and the negative stereotypes in pursuing technical education. And I'm glad we've mentioned the competence-based curriculum, resources constraints. And then the other thing is also the constraints experienced by parents due to the effects of COVID-19 disruptions. So this is also an issue that's coming up, and it is also affecting households. I'm on my last section on other proposals. The issue of providing civic education to bridge information gap on what the government is providing. It's still not resourced, and this is what is meant to bring the economic recovery, especially in this area, and to cushion people against economic shocks. The other thing is on the water, county water and sanitation policies, and supervision of water projects. I believe you've had experiences even in your counties where natural resources are not able to be enjoyed by people in the area, as well as just those water sewerage companies not providing adequate security around water facilities, and even adequate provision of water reliable. So just investing and amplifying efforts around water facilities, and also water harvesting and storage in households and schools. The other thing is addressing food security issues, disaster response management, adoption of food policy paper and food security bills as a reform area, and then also looking into the demand side of food security to make sure that people that the income problems are reduced and people are able to access food. On my last slide is addressing the public debt. I think this was addressed in the first presentation. And then the issue of employer ability promotion. There is the current targets read that we are meant to cater to 52,000 people, and yet the rate of employment is so high. So again, we go back to the targets versus the budget expenditure. So we need an increased targets and increased resources for ensuring that job seekers are able to gain employment. The last one is on the tax incidence on LPG gas, and the implicit gender biases. So this tax has brought about a lot of gender biases in regards to women being the people that are involved mostly in care work in Kenya as a majority, and even just mentioning that is the burden of care work is not well accounted for as an issue, as a sector issue. But going back to the LPG gas and the implicit gender bias, it's just that the government is not subsidizing the burden of care. It's not acknowledging it as part of the GDP contribution. Yet it's also and women are subsidizing those efforts, care work, especially in an area where COVID is really high. Yet we are bringing on new burdens in form of taxes. So, and this is also leading to second order effects, which is bringing the issue of women and girls and other care workers now abandoning the idea of the LPG and going to environmental options, and we will go back to deforestation and causing hazards around our conservation of the environment. So this is also an area that we think should be looked into in regards to tax measures. And then the last thing is just a general comment. We felt that the budget is not gender responsive, and there's need for adequate allocation for gender, and PWD's mainstreaming. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Lilian, for your comprehensive coverage of some of the proposals under the social protection, culture, and the recreation sector. Thank you very much. I know you have covered quite a lot in terms of proposals on the economic front. There are proposals on the action funds. There are proposals on gender mainstreaming, but also some other sectors like WASH and some tax measures that should be put in place. And also you have covered issues on the agricultural sector. So thank you very much. I don't want to go into the details. I just want to open up for the plenary session, the questions. Anyone would be having a comment or even a question so that it can be addressed by our panelists. And one thing I want to mention is that, yes, in the chat box, I have seen a response from Amos Kaburu, a question that was posed by Stephen Jairo, my colleague. But also we have a facility where you can be able to raise your hand and ask a question. Yes. I haven't seen anyone raising his hand. But the question, maybe I can read the question from Stephen Jairo. He was asking about the challenge of increased intake buoyed by 100% transition has seen challenges in many schools across the country. And the question is, are Mr. Kaburu and Dr. Emmanuel suggesting a return of 844 system or full implementation of CBC? What is your position on that? I think that's a question that came from Stephen Jairo. And to some extent, I think Amos Kaburu have tried to answer the question. Maybe if there are no questions, maybe I can ask some clarification. And this one I want to direct to Irene in terms of who shared about perhaps public debt. And my question is on the issue of Kenya. Does Kenya have the necessary tools to deal with the issues to do with the public debt? And given that we had an approval from IMF of around 255 billion shillings approved, and the reason why the approval was there was the reason that we are given is one of the reasons was to reduce debt vulnerabilities, but also strengthening anti-corruption framework. I don't know what's your take on that, Irene. I would like some insights on that, particularly on the IMF approval of loan, focusing on strengthening anti-corruption framework in Kenya.
Thank you, Raphael.
Yes.
So,
I wanted us to have a round of. Let me finish with the last question that has been asked by John, so that we can have a reply from all our panelists. John Mutua, my colleague, is asking, what innovative ways should the government consider for paced up school infrastructure development? Any views on what day schools filling up gaps against the rule regards by parents and learners, stroke learners? I think that's a question that has been posed by Amos and posted by John to Amos and Dr. Emmanuel Imanyasa. And for the purpose of reply from our panelists, I think I'll reverse the order. I don't know whether Lilian, you have any comment.
Not at the moment. I'm still reflecting on the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Then shall we have Dr. Emmanuel Imanyasa to respond perhaps to Stephen and John's question?
Thank you. Let me say let me start with Stephen. We cannot revert to 844 because we have gone a long way in implementing CBC. The issue is that we must acknowledge the challenges that implementing the new system present and look for ways, first of all, ensure that we have costed, because one of the biggest challenges facing CBC implementation is that we have implemented it against no approved costed implementation plan. So we are implementing it haphazardly. We need to get a costed implementation plan in place that gives us the full cost of what it means to implement this whole cycle, this whole transition, which will only be complete at the time when the current grade 5 finish university, and then say, this is the full cost, and this is how much government is able to put into this implementation. So how do we raise the difference? How do we get parents to share into this expenditure? How do we target government expenditure to support those children from households that may not be able to fund the part that parents need to fund, while those parents who are able to contribute and other actors in the public who are able to contribute to fill the gap? When we have a clear costed implementation plan, it will be easier to fund the implementation process. The challenge is there, and I think we can be able to address it in that manner. Get the implementation plan in place with the full cost, see how we allocate the cost and meet the gaps in funding. The question from John Mutua. It is true that there has to be innovative ways to enable government to meet and the Kenyan society to meet the need for infrastructure development in our schools. There has been talk of let us abolish boarding schools and make all schools day school. I think that thought is not deep enough. We know that there are children in parts of this country who will not excel if they go through day schools because of certain social cultural settings that they find themselves in. So boarding schools serve their purpose. Where we need them, we need to make sure they are kept in place so that we are able to support children who need those schools. The reason a lot of parents and a lot of young people have issues against boarding schools, I mean day schools, is not because they are day. It is because of the facilities that are available in those schools and the number of teachers available in those schools. And that's why if you look at our performance, if you look at KCSE results, there is a market difference between the performance of the major schools, most of which are boarding, and the smaller schools, most of which are day. So can we upgrade the infrastructure and the number of teachers and even the competence of teachers in those schools and the quality of leadership? The caliber of the principal of Pangani Girls is not the caliber of the principal of another small day school somewhere. Usually, those small day schools are headed by people who have not had managerial experience. Then they are under-facilitated. They are underfunded because of this capitation model that only goes for the numbers of learners in a school. So the smaller schools get less funding by virtue of having fewer students. And that is what makes a lot of parents not want their children to go there, because those schools are underfunded, they are led by inexperienced leaders, they are under-facilitated and understaffed. If we can deal with those issues, there is no problem with the day schools being an option for children who are in areas where it is easy to commute. There are children in places where it is not easy to commute, and we need to keep the boarding school in place for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa. Amos, do you have any comment?
Yes, thank you. To the question around whether we can revert to 844. Yeah, I think all of us agree that 844, I mean, most of us agree that 844 has fundamental challenges. Where we begin departing and take three pathways are those who believe that 844 is gospel truth. There is nothing wrong with it because they are survivors of a bad system. Then there are those who believe that CBC is the best thing that happened after a slice of bread and M-Pesa. And then there are those of us who give a benefit of doubt to it and say that the challenge is optioning. After you realize that 844 was the problem, what options were put on the table and done all the things, including what Emmanuel has mentioned, the issue of costing, what it will take to implement CBC. Because this question of rushing to argue that implementation is the challenge, but design is not a problem, is a weak design issue. A good design is one that also looks at the implementation feasibility. So if you're going to design something that is not feasible in terms of implementation, then you've generally given to a country a weak system that is bound to face a lot of challenges. So I don't have evidence, but I foresee a situation where we are going to continue with this bickering for a very long time. And possibly in another 5 years, another 10 years, we will be in the same, like what you've had as a constitutional moment, where now people are saying that let's again review the constitution, because at the point of making our constitution, nobody ever thought about costing it. And we clearly again put as a divide of the no and the yes. So that dichotomy brings challenges. So it is important that right at this point in time, we have got a very good understanding of what is needed. And curriculum change should not be seen as the panacea to education problems. The problems in education go beyond the curriculum. And that's why I've given that illustration, that whether you introduce grammar bouts in Nairobi or you put rectangles and all these kind of things that we do, they don't solve the fundamental problems, because the problem with the traffic is not just the number of cars or the matatus. You have to go to deal with the fundamental issues. And I think that's not the discussion for today. On the issue of infrastructure, there are many things that could actually be done. But the challenge is that, one, we don't have an infrastructure policy. So you really can't tell what is the definition of a school from an infrastructure point. You don't know whether there are 2 classrooms, whether there are 3 classrooms as such. But if there was clarity in terms of defining what we mean by infrastructure, it will be easier. And some of us who have done this and engage with it on a daily basis, even in our own academic studies, we've concluded that it's necessary to stop talking about funding education and now begin looking at resourcing education. because when you look at it from the resourcing point, it's broader than just the money. And that's why I've given some of the examples over here. We are talking about a value capture, like this infrastructure that you develop. You must begin to ask those who are benefiting from this infrastructure to fund that those schools. For instance, why does the Nairobi City County put huge billboards at Muthaiga Primary School, where it collects 1 million every month? And yet it cannot even give back even to this school even 50,000 shillings. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. SGR, which has increased the land value, the owners who are reaping huge are not paying anything for this increased value, and yet it is this development that is actually denying an opportunity for recurrent expenditure. So if you go to France and look out, they have effectively used value capture to finance health and education, will be some of the innovative ways. What about green financing? So that when we talk about additional infrastructure, it must be able to meet the requirements of sustainable building construction. You are not going to have school infrastructure that breaks off after 2 or 3 years, and then we are perennially in the business of constructing classrooms. So additionality of infrastructure must increase the benchmarks and the parameters against which it is measured. We are talking about things such as re-engineering what is public-private partnership, including aspects such as the Universal Service Fund. Those who are making profits from the education sector should actually also be made to pay back some of this. Of course, people say that the ripple effects will increase, but it's not necessary that you can have entrepreneurs quickly sneak into education, which is supposed to be a public function, and begin to reap off great profits. You are charging Kenyans 2 million to educate their children, and these profits are being repatriated elsewhere, where those people basically, I mean, will not even invest in this country. It's important, like what the ICT sector has done, that those who profiteer from ICT should actually spend about 2% of those profits to increase access to ICT in areas which are highly marginalized. And that's why we've seen penetration of ICT greatly increase in some of these areas. So there are specific tangible measures that this, if Ministry of Education was more open, they will actually really solve the problem of infrastructure. And therefore, I cap by saying that in my own analysis, I do not think that the Ministry of Education has what it takes for it to plan, deliver infrastructure. We need something that is a little bit more independent, that is able to audit and look at the infrastructure needs, think about how to bring together all these resources, whether they are from CDA, from development partners, from government and everywhere, and now plan to distribute these resources. Otherwise, this is something that the Ministry of Education has perennially failed from 1964. It has never provided more than 10% of infrastructure in our schools. So we must rethink about it, and if we are going to go into CBC with the same thinking, then we're really setting up this system again for bigger challenges, which we continue calling teething problems, that you really can't have teething problems for 5 years, 7 years. Even children only have teething problems for 2 or 3 months. So you can't keep on having problems for years, and then you keep on calling them this just because you have teething problems. Take some Ashton for your child, and then the child will stop having teething problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Amos. Thank you, Amos, for your insights. Jeffrey, do you have any comment? Is Jeffrey still with us?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute.
Okay.
I don't have a comment, maybe just a closing remark and to add on what has already been said on the prioritization of all these funds that the government is collecting. We realize that there is need to prioritize, but what the government is doing as of now, it's more of having, I'm lacking the better term to use, because we can look at the NGAF vehicles being branded and everything, and we will see on paper, even the Auditor General reports, we'll see on paper it's really working, but the impact that it's on the ground, the impact is not felt. When you look at the numbers and what is being felt is two different stories. So I think there is much of work in terms of monitoring and evaluation and value for money, so that we get we can report on the progress. And also the question that Philomena has asked, you know, the National Council for Persons with Disability has a grant for students with disability and from vulnerable families. The problem is that the information does not get to these people. The moment you want to apply now, the moment it has been hinted to you that there is these bursaries, now you meet several hurdles. You are told we need an examination report. You file the examination report, there's a form you fill, and then we all know how government operates. It can take a year before you get the certificate that there is that card, the persons with disabilities card. Now that is the first hurdle. The second hurdle is now the application process. And you'll find there is, I'm sorry about that, I'm having a flu. There is a disconnect between how the national government works and how the government, the county and national government. So you will be sent to an office in the county government. After that, we don't have, the National Council of Persons with Disability has not devolved its services to every county. So that's another hurdle. But yes, on paper, you will find, even when you visit their page, you will find these grants, you'll find all these things. But in between, there is that requirements that to be fulfilled. And we all know persons with disability, vulnerable people, they lack that knowledge. And also in the way this knowledge is, this information is relayed, you will see like somebody with visual impairment, how do you expect such a person to get such information if there are no government officers to mobilize such exercises? So there is a huge gap in terms of even the modalities of reaching out to these people. But yes, there are those funds. Yes, there is that policy in place. There is that allocation in place. But now you'll see the beneficiaries are probably well-connected people, or people who have really benefited from now services like what we are doing, maybe the capacity building sessions we are doing with organized groups. These are CBOs, these are CSOs whom have dedicated their programs towards these groups, but they have just been left alone by the government to find this information and to see how they can plug in. That is the greatest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Irene, are you still there?
Yes, I'd respond to a comment on that, and please allow me to give this as my closing because I need to step out to attend on something else. But yeah, okay, thanks. So IMF approvals, I think I've sometimes I wonder, and I think it's something that every Kenyan citizen does think about. You know, why does IMF say jump and the National Treasury just do it without even questioning? Yeah. And sometimes you'll see, yes, I agree that some of the loans that the IMF does give Kenya are mostly concessional and are more towards, like you say, sort of economic recovery, and even they're quite keen on anti-graft programs or anti-corruption programs. But I think still there is need to actually interrogate to what extent then does these structural adjustment programs or the different programs that have been implemented by IMF do change economically or do change the economical structure of the country. So I think it's not just left as a question of IMF saying do and we do. We also need to interrogate to what extent and what really the benefits of these are. Yeah, because then you'll find that one sector, yes, might benefit from this, but what about the other sectors? What about the informal sector mostly? Yeah, but in order to do that, we need to be very keen on auditing or even monitoring some of these programs implementation, so that then we can be able to ask even questions and demand accountability from duty bearers on implementation of those programs, but also on just subsidizing other means or finding other means to support other programs or other areas that have been adversely affected as well. And on whether we have tools to deal with that, I think, like I said earlier in the presentation, when you're talking about legislation, I hardly think it's a question of do we need more legislation. I think it's a question of we need more implementation rather than the legislations that we have. Even just speaking recently, the debt and borrowing framework that was approved last year, I think July of last year, has very, very good provisions on issues of transparency and accountability on public debt. But do we see that being implemented? Yeah. So it's more of implementation. We have a constitution that is quite keen on transparency and accountability and good governance. We have the public finance management, but to what extent do we implement that? So I think for me, it's more of an implementation issue rather than a regulation or legislation question. And just to conclude, and perhaps support generally what Geoffrey was saying, the issue of public participation, or then to what extent do we enable actual public participation, not the tick box kind of public participation, but actually where we have people participating and understanding what they're participating in and having their views actually being taken up. Because I think apart from the role of government that we are calling for right now and we hope to see in the next budget cycle is transparency and accountability, of course, on the existing finances or the finances that we have, whether it's from revenue or from debt. We want to see more transparency, but also it's upon civil society, institutions, and even the public to just be able to hold government to account. It's good to know, and I think I put the burden of knowledge or capacity building on CSOs, because we have all these CSOs that do work on public finance management. How do you benefit the common citizens? Do citizens know what is provided for in the medium-term debt strategy paper? Yeah. It is upon the civil society institutions and government, yes, to give that information to citizens. For government, it's an obligation that they have to undertake under the Constitution. For CSO, it's basically just a moral obligation that we have to, so that we enable citizens to be able to hold duty bearers to account. But that doesn't leave us from participating also. We have knowledge, we have done research, evidence-based research. We need to participate actively so that, when we have this, we were talking about, or when Koech is talking about then public participation, proper public participation, we can be able to audit that and say, yes, it was done proper public participation. And if not, then what can be done next? So I think it's an obligation on all of us, but we hope that in this budget cycle, that we're going to see better public participation for one, and two, that government is actually taking into consideration some of these proposals, because we don't want to see again a budget deficit of over 1 point something trillion when we have very little revenue collection. Yeah, I think that is it from me, Raphael. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for your insights, and thank you very much for your final comments. I don't think we have further questions or even issues. So what I would like to do is to invite our plenary. Perhaps they share their final comments. Yes, I can see a final question which is addressed to Geoffrey and Ririan. Is the impact of social protection and affirmative action program hampered by design questions and implementation hiccups, and all due to underfunding? I think that's something, Geoffrey, you can quickly be able to address, or Ririan, as we share our final comments. And I will start with Geoffrey this time.
Come up again with that question.
The question is on, is the impact of social protection and affirmative action program hampered by design question and implementation hiccups, or is it due to underfunding?
There is a statement that was made earlier on about a destination and a process. Okay. What I can say, as we are right now, we are looking at it as a as a destination that now we have this allocation. That's good. But we need to move from viewing it as we've arrived at the destination, and we start to work out on now these issues like what I had mentioned earlier on, issues of discrimination, issues of policies that sound so discriminative. One of them being categorization of disabilities. There is adverse disability and there is no adverse disability. How do we arrive to such a conclusion? And also we need to synchronize whatever the national government is doing and what the county government is doing. So there is room for policy development, and these policies will give life to the allocation, because the budgetary allocation at the moment, where we find ourselves as a country with the deficits that we are trying to fill, the moment we have the right policies in place, even the allocations will start making sense. But if the allocations, we are looking at billions of money, but you find that they end up in wrong pockets, we find that even the target groups themselves are not aware of these funds. And there is no civic education on this aspect. And the social protection sector, when you ask people in the villages, they only know of pesa za wazee, because, and I'm sure it is by design, because that is what the area chiefs are really campaigning for. They are forgetting the vulnerable orphans and vulnerable children. They are forgetting persons with disabilities. They are forgetting their inclusion in social economic development. So that is a huge gap in terms of information and how we bring them on board. But the allocation, I'm sure, since this is an ongoing process, if we streamline the challenges from a policy aspect, I'm sure by the time now we are improving in terms of monetary allocation, this money will find value since we'll have streamlined the policy issues that we are facing at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Amos, your final comment, please.
No, I don't have anything more to say. I had concluded. Thank you.
I think we have lost Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa. So, Ririan, do you have your final comment, please?
Yes, I would love to comment on John Mutua's question on what is the issue. Is it design? Is it implementation or underfunding? On my end, I would think it's a hybrid of all these things, just coming together and then causing challenges. Because if we begin with the design, whom are we designing these affirmative action programs for? For instance, we know that 60.7% of unlicensed businesses are from women, and women are the ones who are accessing this affirmative action as a majority. But then we end up asking for so much documentation and looking out for registration of firms. So at the end, it starts from really way up high. In regards to implementation, we do not have disaggregated data to see who is accessing what. So we end up not serving the right constituents. PWDs end up lagging behind. We end up having people posing or people having some hybrid forms of farms that look as if they are for marginalized groups. So it's really also on implementation and even issues of corruption around registration of these farms and administration of the funds. In regards to unallocated funds, we are still having a lot of underfunding, starting from the State Department of Gender and up to the program-based funding. So I think also in conclusion, I would say the issue is on planning, planning against targets and planning against targets for what impact we want to have, because then if we are just planning because of what we have, then we are sort of planning blindly, and we do not expand our scope into bringing in more resources, into thinking what innovative ways, what efforts are being done to bring in money to fund what is a priority. So I think if we plan better for our people, it will work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lilian. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody, particularly for bearing with us. I know we have gone beyond our normal time. We were supposed to finish by quarter to midday, and we are already past half to 12:30. But two things which comes to my mind is that the reason why we are doing this is because we want to synthesize these proposals and share with the National Treasury. But what we need to keep in mind is that the government, of course, operate with estimation of revenue, but of course with having a range of expenditure issues that it have to commit itself to. But one thing that is very clear is that choices will have to be made, and one of the choices is that the government have to prioritize the various plans so that it can be able to implement its program. So as an institution, what we will do is that we will sit back as an institution and as a PFM group where we are going to synthesize all these proposals and prepare them in a memorandum we normally call the Citizen Alternative Budget. After that, of course, we will be able to have a launch where we'll be able to share with the presenters, but of course with the members of the public on the outcomes of what we are going to present. But more important, we are going to share with the National Treasury. Number two, just to let you know that for us to be able to effectively participate in public in the various sector working group, I think there are avenues which are created. And next week, I think there will be public hearings, and they will start on 13th up to 15th, where we can be able to share our views on the various sectors. So we encourage individuals to go to Kenya International Conference Center, where you can be able to share your views on the various sectors. And finally, is of course to understand that the budget cycle where it runs because of election, I think it has been condensed. So what used to happen in the month of January, perhaps it is happening in the month of December. So it is important to keep in mind because of election. I think some of the activities that used to happen in the month of May will be happening in the month of February, like or even March. Something like budget approval. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody. And I say you bear with us because of time. And thanks to all participants, all the presenters, and all my IEA colleagues. And I want to wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.